Welcome to this episode of Military Mindset for Business, where we go from combat logistician to C-suite. So today's guest is a good friend of mine, Luke Morris, and we're going to unpack his story from going from being a combat logistician, running operations in theatre in Afghanistan, through to his transition to how he became the supply chain director for Audi Australia. So from combat logistician to C-suite executive in just a couple of short years. This episode is really interesting about how we unpack some of the basics of military mindset and how businesses, whether big or small, all seem to go through the same problems. So a really fantastic episode with a really intelligent guy, Luke Morris. We hope you enjoy it. So for today's Military Mindset for Business podcast, I've got a good friend and former colleague, Luke Morris, here joining me. Luke's got a really fascinating story for me, and I'm really interested to learn about his application of what he did in the military, which was really a supply chain specialist, and how he's been able to transition those skills through to pretty significant roles with significant players in the Australian corporate space. So, hey, Luke, welcome.
Thanks, Pete. Nice to be here.
Fantastic. So, Luke, one of my former RMC classmates, Royal Military College Duntrin classmates, we've had parallel careers as logisticians in the Army. However, you went into supply chain. Can you just take me back to the start and really got you? Why did you join the military in the first place? Where did you come from? Give us a way back.
Yeah, sure. No worries. So I grew up in Adelaide and my family are all still based there. I didn't necessarily have direct military service in my family, with the exception of my two grandfathers. One was a British medic and the other one was a rifleman in the Australian Army, both in World War II. My grandfather on my father's side in the British Army, commissioned in the field actually to be an officer. And he had a long military career, but he passed away before I was born, so I never actually got to speak with him. And on my mother's side, same thing. My grandfather passed away early, but he was served in Papua New Guinea and got a mention in dispatches for some combat action there. And so I grew up as a child, sort of hearing a little bit about this, but it wasn't really a big focus for me. And probably my teenage years, around 15 or 16. I was very into sport. Had lots of mates and very active. And I did like one of those leadership adventure courses as a sort of a teenager, where you go away on a sailing ship for a week and you sort of learn how to be a bit of a leader. And I absolutely loved it. And I thought to myself, I don't really, want to do a job where I'm sort of sitting in an office all the time. I look at what my friends had been doing, or those who are graduating and they're going to university, and that was appealing to me. But I kind of wanted something a little bit more dynamic. And so I actually just rocked up to the recruitment agency one day in the city in Adelaide and just said, look, I'd like to apply. And they said, do you have any idea what you want to apply for? And I didn't know anything about sort of the Australian Defence Force Academy, or RMC. And I just said, look, I'm just happy to throw my hat in the ring and see what happens. It's kind of funny because that's almost the same mantra I still have today. And I did the assessments, and they said, look, you're suitable to go to this Defence Force Academy, and go to be an officer. And I said, oh, that sounds great. So what does that mean? Like, we'll send you to university and we'll train you in that field, and away you go. So I was like, all right, sounds great. And then I signed up, and then all of a sudden I found myself at the Australian Defence Force Academy.
So you rock up at ADFA. What degree did you do there?
It was really bizarre because so at school I was doing like maths, like physics, some English, like social sciences. And I went to ADFA and I selected an IT degree and a geography degree. So I double majored in information systems and geography. And it was purely just out of interest, because I wasn't really clear on, what do I want to know academically, which is more, this is interesting to me, and the sort of job that I'm doing in the Army is the one I want to do, hopefully. So this for me is sort of a, bit of a rounding experience and kind of learn something new. And then I remember probably towards the end of my time there, what I really found was that, the social sciences side of geography was really interesting for me, and particularly the human side. And I think that played quite nicely into being a leader and, understanding people in various cultures later on. And then on the information systems side, it was all about systems and processes, etc. Have certainly been a big part of my career since.
It's for one thing that trust the process is a business that's all about processes and systems. But for me, the ability to capture excellence and repeat has been something that's been foundational to everything that we've done in business. So now you've gone through ADFA, you've come over the hill, you've done your year over at Duntroon to focus on Army specific stuff. Tell us about the next 10 years or so in a couple of moments about your military journey and what some of the key takeaways were from your personal experience in the Army.
Yeah, I think, the first thing I'd say is the friendships that I built at the Royal Military College have probably been the strongest friendships I've ever had in my life. I think, we're still in touch many, many, many years later, and, I talk to yourself and others, and, that bond is super strong. And I think that actually is repeated throughout my military career as well, around where you've gone through an experience with your colleagues and you're all on the same page. And so in the sort of remaining 9 years that I served, I spent my first 3 years up in Townsville, and I deployed on the mentoring and reconstruction task force 2 to Tarankot in Afghanistan for 7 months, and then moved to Brisbane as a captain and had a number of roles. I worked with the artillery regiment and deployed with them to Kabul on the Afghan mentoring and training task force. It was a very small element, I think about 15 or 20 people training in a camp of 14,000 ANA. And then I went to the largest logistics organisation, Defence, 9FSB, as the adjutant there for 2 years. And then I went to the deployable joint force headquarters in Brisbane there for the last year, and I was doing supply chain planning for future operations for them. And it was at that time that decided to make a move.
So you were really lucky to get operational experience in your trade. So just to confirm, was your first deployment to Afghanistan in a trade role?
So I was the 2IC of the logistics unit. So there was a niche capability, maybe about 170 people. It was led by a good friend of mine, and I was his 2IC. And so, that was direct, logistics operations in a hostile environment, moving forward with the combat elements and setting up their forward supply bases.
Let's unpack that a little bit, what that role entails. So like in the military, we've got two big sort of divisions of our manpower. We've got the war fighters, the infantry, the armor, the artillery. They're out there, at the sharp point. Then we've got the logisticians who are right up behind them supporting those elements. Tell us a little bit about, your experiences in the theatre about supporting the war fighters.
Yeah, so I was very fortunate that both of the deployments that I had were with the combat elements as a supply chain SME embedded. And so I was pretty much operating, shoulder to shoulder with them in a lot of ways. And so I talk about my first experience, and I'll give you a clear example of Murabad, which was a valley that when we deployed, there was no, coalition presence in that area. It was quite a strong Taliban hold. And we set up a patrol base in the middle of Murabad and just sort of plonked it in there. And sort of my experience was to deploy with the engineers and the forward combat element to build the patrol base. So there was an initial clearance operation that happened with the infantry, and then we went and met with the infantry and set up a stronghold with them. So you're talking, digging, your pits with them, living with them, and helping to supply them, making sure that they've got everything from, food, water, ammunition, comms gear, etc., and working out how do you resupply them in some terrain that's quite challenging, either via air through helicopters or over through full drive sort of capable trucks and trailers, or in some instances sort of just doing small 4x4 replenishment to the most forward units.
Really making me think here is again, a baptism literally by fire in some terms, but understanding those principles of supply chain and logistics really early in the most hostile situations. The training in that you understood, it's one thing to do it in the classroom and understand how lines of supply and all of this works, but to actually get out there in the field and to have to make this happen in real time to sustain the fight must have been a really great learning experience and set a great foundation for you.
It certainly did. And I think for me personally, it sort of started to create a sense of what I stood for and the sort of logistician and supply chain person that I want to be. And how that sort of has echoed through the rest of my career around, being reliable, being dependable, being a clear communicator, but most importantly, understanding the need and being able to deliver that need at the right time with the least amount of inconvenience for them, because they're often focused on their next objective or the next 3 objectives, and so it's important that you start to anticipate what they are. And how do you position sort of supplies, resources, capability to support that so that you don't slow down the tempo? In fact, you can be a multiplier of the tempo because it allows them to, regenerate quicker and move forward.
Can you give us an example of, this is just-in-time supply chain management in the field or in combat, and how that actually worked? Can you just unpack a little bit more about being that combat multiplier and the effects of getting it right?
Yeah, I think there's some really good examples again in that experience I had in my first tour, where we were sort of expanding into new territory that we need a lot of support in, and so obviously the environmental conditions were challenging. So it was either super, super hot in the middle of summer, or in the winter it was freezing. So you needed to make sure that you had the right equipment available for them to be able to have access to, the amount of water that was required, where it could be accessed, how do you purify it, making sure we had the right food, and particularly, we were partnering with the Afghan army, and so obviously there needs to be halal available meals for them, and some of the culturally sensitive components as well to allow them to be productive as well. And so having a clear view of sort of what's the strategy over the next few months, what are we hoping to achieve? And then having a think about, well, if the combat elements or this team here want to deliver this outcome by this time, having a think through, what's the sort of resources they're going to need to deliver that, and how do we start to build in a contingency and redundancy plans in, so that if the plan doesn't go perfectly well, how do we support them and make sure that we don't sort of dry up on particular commodities, for example, and so that there's sort of that ability to be agile. And I think it'd be clear that is sort of looking at, apart from searching objectives, so to speak, it's more about looking at, what's the long-term outcome, and what are they going to likely need to draw on at that stage, and then pull that forward at the right time, but not too early. So it's a bit of a balancing act, and making sure that you go, actually, yes, we've got that available here for you. Your vehicles are a force multiplier, so we need to make sure we've got the right maintenance equipment, for example, here for you. And I think they're the sorts of examples that I would draw upon. And it became more complicated when we were working in a coalition environment as well, where we were working, in partnership with the US, Afghans and the Australian forces and the Dutch forces as well.
And this isn't just about stores. As you mentioned there, it's about maintenance, it's about health and medical assets, it's about transport. It is a multi-pronged logistic approach. So now we've come out of, so you've done that tour, you've come back to Australia, you've had a real, taste of, being right at the tip of the spear, supporting the warfighting assets. Unpack next, when you got back into the military, where your career path took you, ultimately to deploy Joint Force Headquarters. Was that right?
Yeah, so when I came back, I actually was an assistant adjutant in the logistics battalion in Townsville, and it was a significant U-turn on life.
Yeah.
So from the tip of the spear sort of combat elements, where really meaningful work, working really closely with the infantry, and I'd made some amazing bonds with these people, and then going all the way to the rear in logistics to water transport, and just going, this looks nothing like what I've been doing for the last 2 years, and I'm now in an administrative role, processing paperwork, checking this and that, and so for me it was a huge transitional shift, frankly, to go to that.
But mate, don't underestimate the importance of doing the duty officer roster properly. These are big time things. Now these are big time important important roles. So again, but this is this constant friction about being, one moment you're over there doing the job for real, next thing you're just back into the routine of being like everybody else.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm interested now about understanding. So you've a real sort of tactical level of understanding of getting supply to the right people at the right time at the right place. Let's now unpack and go a little bit deeper into military logistics from a broader scale, particularly sustaining the army in a national perspective, What kind of roles have you had and experience in that space?
Yeah, I think that when I came back from Afghanistan the second time, and I was with 9 Force Support Battalion as the adjutant there, that was really sort of that strategic supply chain, capability. And I think bringing some of the experience that I had with the artillery was quite a nice adage to that, because we were doing third line artillery support. So I remember during Talisman Sabre, I can't remember what year it was, we were doing an artillery raid. So like one of the things I organised was direct artillery distribution from third line transport, so from 9FSB directly to the front line. So we were sort of starting to merge the strategic and the tactical together. And so I think then moving to 9FSB and looking at how do we sustain the force, not just sustain sort of the operation, was quite a big difference. So you're looking at hundreds of thousands of litres of diesel, looking at like containers and containers and containers full of water and food and ammunition and stores, and then deploying that in strategic reserves around Australia to make sure that we could do the job that we wanted to do. Looks like you want to ask something.
Yeah, look, I just want you to unpack them, because I was never a scholar in any of my military logistic courses. But can you just share with us the difference between first, second, and third line and fourth line support?
Yeah, so first line support is your combat logistics, essentially. So in an infantry battalion, there'll be an embedded logistics organisation, and within those logistics organisation, there's effectively a business partner for each company. And that business partner is the first line logistics support. So they help to make sure they understand, how many bullets they need, how much water they need, et cetera, and to get it to them. The second line logistics are sort of large logistics organisations that cover transport, warehousing, medical, maintenance, and a few other bits and bobs that support a brigade or support a combat organisation. So if you're looking at sort of geographically, like Townsville or Brisbane or Darwin, each of those have a brigade with them, and they have a second line logistics support. And so they know how to work really quite effectively with those combat elements, but they work with those business partners that I mentioned earlier. The third line logistics support is really where you start to get into strategic supply chain support. So replenishing those brigade second line units that I spoke about. So you're talking bulk fuels, bulk liquids, bulk fuel, food, medical drugs. And these are also a key component of this is we start getting quite technical on your maintenance requirements, but also from a field hospital perspective. So this is where you start seeing surgery and other various capabilities that start to come in. And then finally, your fourth line logistics organisation is basically strategic government procurement, would be the way I describe it. So they're looking at, I'm setting up contracts with civilian providers to build submarines or buy food or et cetera, et cetera. And so they are the sort of the stores and maintenance capabilities that exist really, really deep in the supply chain. And they're not really ever involved in the combat components, other than sometimes the fourth line logistics organisations will resupply our forces overseas directly to a port. So, for example, resupplying the base in Abu Dhabi, the Defence Force were in for Afghanistan.
And this is a really interesting model now about how, so number one, depending on the size of your business unit or the size of your business, are you providing that capability internally for yourself? Are you relying on that partner, which is one step back supplying you? Are you relying on your partner's partner, which is, further back? Because if we have a look at the kind of assets that were at the 9th Force Support Battalion, just talk us through those kind of assets, because I think that will clearly sort of describe what third line support's about. Yeah,
so you're talking like line haul, B-double transportation assets en masse. So, trucks,
big semi-trailers.
Big semi-trailers, large warehousing capability. So, you're talking, probably 50,000 pallet, 50,000 square meter DCs that hold like strategic reserves of food, ammunition, etc., various parts. You've also got bulk fuel requirements. So they're holding hundreds and hundreds of thousands of litres of fuel and assets to deploy the fuel. And then it also has sort of hospital requirements. But there's also an air dispatch unit there. So looking at, how do we use the Hercules, etc., to supply our forces from the air if we need to do that as well.
So this is really interesting now, and this is the essence of military mindset for business. So let's have a quick snapshot or reflection of your career to this point. So we've done a university degree, even if it's generalist, then we come back and we do some military training focused on the army at Duntroon. You're straight out then within a short time into the battle space of Afghanistan, where you're doing combat resupplies. But then very shortly, in a year or two later, you're supporting the management of national level logistics. It's just such a broad spread in a very, very short time, and a really drinking through the fire hose of experience.
Absolutely. And I decided at the same time to do a master's in project management. And so I was talking to someone the other day. I studied, information systems, project management, and geography, and I do logistics. So I actually have never studied in the field that I work in, other than this project management has a lot of application to sort of what I have been doing the last few years. And so, that just added to the fire hose. However, it's really interesting. The military appreciation process, which is the military planning process, is by far the most fantastic planning process that I've ever seen. And it's far superior to anything I've seen in the corporate world as well, moving forward. And so I think, being able to bring that forward with the project management experience, with this wealth of experience, really helped sort of as I started to lead defence.
Well, mate, I'm going to throw you in the deep end here a little bit. So the military appreciation process can be scaled, relative to applicability. So we've got a combat military appreciation process, which just takes you through a few really simple steps, how to make a decision in the field, through to an individual military appreciation process when you're doing a plan for your team, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, coming up to sort of a staff level, or let's just say, for example, a business doing $1 million a year or a couple of million in revenue. Can you talk me through, and I'm going to throw you on the spot, the couple of the stages in the military appreciation process for a business of that size?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you've definitely put me on the spot because it's been 8 years since I've done one. But
I can help. Between the two of us, we can work it out.
Yeah, look, I think the first part is understand the situation, right? And that's that the ACOCA, or the sort of the landscape view, is the most important part that any organisation can look at. So it doesn't matter if you're a small scale, mid-size, or a large size organisation, but someone around the sort of 1 to 2 million revenues mark, should have a good understanding of what the competitive landscape looks like. And we're sort of not just talking about who am I competing against. We're talking about the market. So what's the market doing? What are the market trends? What are the market headwinds? What's the economic headwinds that go with that as well? What are the opportunities? And what's the odds that the strategy is going to be successful? So as you start to build that towards, how do you start to look at things? And I draw some parallels between how do I use the terrain to help with my plan? Well, how do I use the market and the gaps that I can see in the market to exploit my opportunities? And I think that's the first thing to look at. The second thing to look at is around sort of the critical capabilities construct, that center of gravity construct. That's what it's called. With critical capabilities, critical requirements, and critical vulnerabilities. Now, for me, I have repeatedly seen this as a weakness in the corporate sector. That a lot of planning struggles to really comprehend. They know what they need to execute what they need to execute. They understand the requirements of that. So I'm going to need this resource. I'm going to need that. But one of the things that I think is overlooked quite a lot is, what are my vulnerabilities? And so they're looking at vulnerabilities from this is going to cost me a lot of money. Well, that's actually not a vulnerability. That's just a fact. And a vulnerability is, I'm weak in this area, or I don't have sufficient contingency plans to ensure that if I have an outage, or I lose a little bit of capability, that I can maintain my operations through this. And so that's one of the things that I think it starts to bring forward. And we talk about a military mindset of business. Military leaders and ex-military people naturally do this. They look at how do I protect my weaknesses?
Really interesting you say that, because in my experience, in all of the business that I've done and with the people that we've worked with, business has generally a lot more of just a blue sky, should be right. Let's just roll through the plan and everything will be okay. Whereas the military looks at the exact opposite. We expect everything to go wrong, and we prepare for everything to go wrong, so that at that moment we can react quickly and we can take advantage of the situation going wrong.
And I think that is, having that baseline and that understanding and the mission analysis profile is the most important aspect. And when I was in defence, I found the same thing. If you get your mission analysis right, the rest almost happens naturally because it guides the rest of your decision making.
Mm.
And I think that's a little part, particularly around the strategy room. And, I've been quite fortunate that I've been in a few senior roles and been part of the strategy process for some businesses, with like 13 billion in revenues. Look at the mission analysis is something that's probably not given the time and effort that it's needed in some instances. And, I think about sort of that 1 to 2 million sort of business, people will think, well, I'm not a large business per se, so I don't need to spend as much time on that. Well, actually, it's probably the opposite. Being a small to mid-sized business, that's where all of your effort should be. Because after that, you're really going to start to know, well, I've got 2 course of actions that I want to work on from here. And you're probably immediately going to discount your third one because you'll know that's not where my strengths lie and I can't protect the downside on that. So, when you start to develop those course of actions, then you can test them. And one of the things that I've also found is quite useful is having people with different capabilities. So people in defence are very good at picking holes in plans because that's what we're trained to do. We're trained to find, here's a gap, how are we going to cover that gap? What if the enemy does this? What are you going to do about that? Well, what if your competitor does this? What's your strategy in the market? What's your brand pivot that you're going to make to be able to continue to be relevant? And then starting to put those plans in place. And I think that the final part around that, particularly that 1 to 2 million revenue sort of business, when we talk about decision and execution in the military appreciation process, we're actually talking about enacting a strategy and execution, but supporting that execution with resources, rather than the old adage of spreading your resources so thin it's like peanut butter on a piece of bread. You want to make sure that your resources are deployed in the right area with the right relationship with the right people as well.
Mate, I'm going to pluck out. That sounds like a principle of warfare. Isn't concentration of force maybe one of those? If I'm
indeed, yeah.
Plucking back to my 15 years ago at RMC.
Mate, that's right.
You've really just broadly gone over the stages of the military appreciation process. And I think, whether you're a startup, 1 million business, $1 billion business, these principles are the same. And we were using these same principles, in a military unit where you might be potentially running tens of millions of dollars worth of assets into brigade or divisional kind of level where there's hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars worth of assets. And more importantly, lives at stake in terms of how people really as a key part of this environment. Mate, I'd like to maybe unpack the next big chapter of your life and your transition from the military into the corporate world. What made you do the big jump, and where did your life go next?
Well, when I came back from my second tour in Afghanistan and I was working in the logistics organization, I had a bit of a think about sort of what does success for me look like in the military. When I started, all I could think about was I'd love to go and deploy to a country somewhere and have this wonderful experience. And so after doing that a couple of times, I sort of found myself with a bit of a view of, do I want to be a lifelong military person? And for me, I had this sort of decision in front of me because for you, Pete, you would know, there's a bit of a pathway that you follow. So you sort of do this job followed by this job, this course, this job, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I was waking up in the morning and that thought wasn't exciting me as much as it previously had. And I think the reason it wasn't exciting me as much as it had was because I hadn't tried anything else. So I was like, I'm not actually sure if, the corporate world would suit me, whether I like it, whether I felt like I was selling my soul every day when I go and do this sort of work. And so I started hunting around for a role, and I interviewed with a few organizations, but it just wasn't sort of appealing to me, the roles that were sort of coming up. And then I randomly got approached on LinkedIn actually via a recruiter saying, hey, do you want to work for Aldi? And I remember the week before being in an Aldi store. One had just recently opened in Fortitude Valley in Brisbane where I lived, and my immediate reaction was absolutely not. So I don't know what's going on inside there, but it's absolute chaos, and I'm not sure that scanning groceries is going to be something that's of interest to me. And they sort of said to me, look, we would employ you in the leadership role. You wouldn't be leading one store, you'd be leading probably 5. You would be, there's a training program that goes with it, and we would have someone that you buddy up with to be supported. And for me, I was like, well, actually, in terms of managing the downside, going to a company that's a enormous global organization that was going to give me some training, that was going to partner me with someone, sounded like, well, that's going to minimize a lot of the risk. Sorry, go on.
So when did this, so this must have been around, what was it, 2012, 2013, something like that?
2015. Yeah, so it all happened quite quickly. So I'd been at the Deployable Joint Force headquarters for about 6 months. And from the initial contact to having the job offer was 4 weeks. So I wasn't actually really prepared for it, frankly. And yeah, so I had to make a move.
The reason I want to put the date on that is to really look at how your career, and share how your career has really accelerated. So we've done our 9 odd years of being in what we call the real army outside of schools and universities. You've now got into a leadership-based role, which was nothing to do with your, let's call it your technical or core skills, your trade skills in the military, but more of your generalist officer skills. You're now in Aldi. But that's your story with Audi really takes off from here.
Yes, so you're right, Pete. I mean, I wasn't hired because I was a logistics expert. I was hired because I had leadership capability. And they had a view of, we have an area in our business that's not performing very well. Luke has experience leading teams in various environments for 8 or 9 years. We don't necessarily need to worry so much about, does he have the right leadership capability? We just need to teach him how to do the retail side of the business. And so, the gaps from defense really are, profit and loss management. That's something that you don't really get exposure to. You don't really understand, your commercial models around, margin and how to control costs. And then the other, you conceptually get it, but it's not something you've practiced in. And then the other part is working in an environment where the in industrial relationship landscape is quite different to defence. So people under EBAs, under various contracts, and so there's kind of these nuances that you weren't really familiar with. So I started with them, and I was meant to be on this 12-month training program, and quite quickly they sort of recognised we don't need to do that. So after about 3 months, they promoted me to be an area manager, and I was working in Coffs Harbour for about a year after that, just shy of a year. And I had a bunch of stores that were not performing very well, and I had to open a brand new store. So just to give you a bit of context to that, I'd been out of defence for 4 months. I had been thrown into an environment that was completely foreign to me. I was now living in a different area with no one around who I knew, with a whole bunch of people who I was trying to get to know who worked for me. Had to open a retail supermarket myself in this area, and I was responsible for the entire thing. So the building was like there, and then getting it from a shell to having racks, to having goods, to having merchandising layout, having the price cards, complying with all the government requirements, hiring all the staff, getting them all trained. That was all my responsibility. So it was, the fire hose drinking was on full at that stage, definitely.
But even though that was brand new for you, it's not unknown in the military just to be doing one job in December, get posted to the other side of the country, given a totally different role in a totally different part of the military. And it's just basically, right, crack on, here we go.
Yeah, exactly right. And you have to rely on the things that you know, and the things that you know are things you know about yourself. If I put a plan in place and I follow that plan, it's probably going to work. I need to be able to adjust that plan as I go. I need to understand what's the goal I'm trying to achieve here, and then what are the needs that I have to deliver on that goal, and also how do I empower my people to do that? How do I find the leaders who work for me and give them the direction and intent they need to go and do their part of the job, and trust them to do their job as well? And so it's a really great experience.
I just want to grab you there, right? Because that is so super important. The ability to be able to delegate, to elevate, that the world will not be, you can't do everything yourself. You've got to empower your people. You've got great team members around you. You've got to find out who the leaders are, and how do you empower them to have that multiple or compounded effect on what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, and the part of it with trust as well, because I think a lot of people are worried that people will make mistakes. But you don't learn unless you make mistakes. I've made plenty of mistakes in my professional career, military and corporate, and I've learned an immense amount from them. And so those people that work for me, sometimes, it's okay that they make mistakes. And I think it's about managing the downside.
For me, for anyone listening out there, there's just Google Mission Command. And it is a really simple way to empower your people. It's about not micromanaging, about not getting into the micro detail, but empowering great people to achieve your intent or your effect, and allowing them to go out and build the plan for you. Again, some of these really simple principles. So, okay, within 4 months, thrown in the deep end, running stores, opening stores, leading teams, where to next?
I got a call from my boss who had said the company had run an employee engagement survey. And in their distribution centre, which was based just south of Brisbane, there's a 55,000 square metre distribution centre. They got the results back, and it was a really, really poor result. In particular, the temperature sensitive, like cold handling areas, so everything that manages from produce to chocolates to milk to frozen fish. The employees that worked in that half of the DC, so it's about 20,000 square metres, their engagement score was very, 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 very low. And they'd made a decision to make some changes in the leadership team. And as a result, they knew that I had a supply chain background from my time in defence, and would I be interested in sort of taking on the role. Now, mind you, again, this is a new experience for me. The first response they got from me was, absolutely, let's go for it. Just to sort of, if that's the job that you feel that I'm going to have the most impact in, then absolutely, let's go and do it. And that, again, is such a reflection of the military, which is, all right, here's your new set of orders. Here's what we're going to need you to go and do, and crack on. And that's pretty much how I looked at it as well.
Yeah, it's just being bold, isn't it? Like you that point, you mentioned something a little bit earlier, which is really important here, is the belief in yourself. But the belief in yourself comes from not only you understanding who you are as a person and your values, but the belief in your training and the structures that you've got at your support.
Yeah. And I think the other part is that, when people talk to me, and I talk to them about this sort of stuff, they go, you're so confident, you just backed yourself, while shitting myself. The whole time, there wasn't a part of me that was like, I'm going to nail this immediately. There's a big part of me that's like, holy crap, what have I done? Like this, I have no idea what I'm doing here. And, this is a completely foreign environment, and it could go all very badly. But, I just focused on what I knew to focus, which is I'm going to be working with people. That's one of the things I really enjoy. And I like looking after my team, building a team and making them successful. So it doesn't really matter what the topic is, what the technical capability is. There's going to be people on my team who know it better than I do. And I don't need to be the technical expert. I just need to be the person that's helping to open the gate on the road that they're already driving. And that's the kind of way that I look at it.
Yeah, mate, this is so powerful. There's a real drop of ego here in terms of not holding on to things, like really letting go. Coming back to what you're talking about, the old no cuff too tough, and that bias for offensive action, we're just going to lean in and give it a crack.
Yeah. And I think, my experience, both having done that, but also being a leader who has got people to do that for me, is, allowing them to go through that process and, finding their way forward, because it's not a straight line. I think a lot of people like looking at plans and going, here's my plan. I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do that. And there's the outcome. Perfect, tick in the box. And that makes people feel really comfortable. But the reality is, I love the old adage of no plan survives the first shot in battle. And that's the same in the business world, which is, I've got this fantastic plan. We've got an election coming up. My sales have dropped 20%. My plan is out the window, right? So, I now need to have a think about what am I going to do differently? But the plan is good. So can you find a way to make yourself way back to the plan? Or do you need to just create a new plan? And I think, that's a big part of it.
I love it. I've started taking up a bit of amateur boxing in my middle years, just to claim a bit of that, former glory. And there's that classic Mike Tyson t-shirt, everyone's got a plan until you get punched in the face. But the ultimate thing is, at least after you get punched in the face, you've still got a plan to refer to. Once the dust settles, and if the plan doesn't work, at least you've considered what's going on so you can make adjustments. So we're within a year of this?
Yes. So I've gone into this role. I had some employees that were just frankly very upset with the business, the work environment, everything. And it was all really boiled down to just it was poor planning, poor resource planning. So overspend on financial commitments, and then a requirement to pull back quite hard on those financial commitments. And in terms of costs in your P&L, payroll is always a large cost, and it's very easy for people to go, I need to cut my payroll costs because obviously if I do that, I'm going to change the way my P&L looks. But what when you're working in an environment where you need people to execute a plan, and particularly in a labor-intensive environment like warehousing and transportation, you can't just shave people off and expect to execute the same profitability levels and the productivity levels that you once did. So we started to create benchmarks and standards and said, these are the labor benchmarks that we need to have a look at. This is what, on average, most people are able to do. And why do we have these outliers? People that are performing way, way, way beyond that, and people that are performing way, way, way below that. And so, and being really open and honest, just as I would as an officer with my soldiers, saying, we've got these people that are just absolutely blitzing it. Can you guys come and help train the rest of the team? Because there's obviously something you're doing that's way better than everyone else. Share it, share the knowledge. Also, why are these people finding it so hard? And what we had found is that no one was following any SOPs because no SOPs had been updated. No one even really knew what they were. And so, it was a case of saying, well, let's create the way that we want to work under this intent. And so creating a bit of a construct to say, what are to the point you made earlier around vision, what's the vision that we have for this team? Where do we want to go and how do we start delivering on that? And that really starts to nest quite nicely into commander's intent, 1 up and 2 up.
Well, that's a real surprise for me to hear that because, again, we spoke about it at the start of this process and systems. And I actually love it because for me, process equals capture excellence and repeat. And we do that for as long as we can until we learn. And then when we learn, we embed the new learning. And then we do that until we learn again. And I'm really surprised that, in a multi-billion-dollar company that there's still these kind of room for improvement in big players. Yes.
And it's often I get that feedback as well, Pete, when I talk to people about it. And I think the thing to keep in mind is that, like any organization, when you're rapidly growing, at speed, you talk Aldi were growing at, double digit, 20% growth annually for their first 10 years. It's enormous. Like, it's extremely challenging to keep up with that. And there's parts of your organization that you need to keep growing to keep delivering on that, and parts of organizations that will evolve naturally. Where the tipping point occurs is when there's a change in the landscape. And I think this is where, going back to mission analysis becomes so important, in the business context and in the strategy room. So strategy rooms will go, well, for example, last year we had a sales growth of 7%. We ran an EBIT of 2.1%. So this year we're going to try and aim for a sales target of 7.5% and EBIT of 2.5%. Tick, done, right? And so if you're growing, you probably don't have to think too much about it. It's going to happen anyway, and your costs are controlled because you've got more top line growth. But as you start to mature as an organization, your top line growth starts to come, instead of this huge curve, it starts to become a little bit more flat. All of a sudden, through your P&L, your fixed costs and your variable costs start to look a bit different as a proportion to the work that you're doing. And I think, where Aldi were when I joined was they were an organization that was heading into maturity, but didn't necessarily have the right structures, processes, people and capability in place to deliver on that maturity that they needed so that they could go to their next level that they wanted to achieve. And that's ultimately what I did in that space, which was set up, and it was basics. It was focused on the basics. And I remember always thinking when I was in the army, we have all these generals come out and talk to us as junior officers, and you remember Pete saying, this year we're going to focus on the basics. And every time I thought, this guy, oh my God, here we go again. We're going to be out there doing God knows what is completely irrelevant, and we're going to be doing it for months and months and months and months. But as I've sort of matured in my professional career, the amount of times that I've said, we're going to focus on the basics is
so powerful. It is so powerful. My first bit of advice as I marched into the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment as a young platoon commander, from my boss at the time, who was a guy called Wade Stothart, he said, Pete, all you need to do to be highly successful in this place is be brilliant at the basics. And I really didn't understand what that meant, because when you get into a new job and you're really enthused and, you just want to get in and make change, it's what you want, but is it what the organizational needs? And being brilliant at the basics has just been my mantra for the rest of my career ever since. Do the little things right and everything just rolls through.
I'm the same. And I found that, senior executive roles, and particularly in big businesses, they're highly stressful. And there's a lot of anxiety at the C-suite level, and you know, a few levels down as well, because everyone comes to work and wants to do the absolute best job they can. They want to deliver the profits to their shareholders that they say they're going to deliver. So it's high pressure environment. What I've always found is that just simply saying, let's just focus on the basics. Anxiety comes down in that room. All of a sudden, people go, actually, well, what are the basics? And then you have this conversation, and everyone knows them. And go, when was the last time we had a conversation with our team about performance reviews? You know, when was the last time we had a conversation with our team about, you know, let's take 5 minutes and go, are we doing the right process here? You know, and you know, is there any steps we can just eliminate? You know, have we spoken with our team and said, you don't follow the process, why not? And they say, well, this process is way faster. I'm like, well, let's change it. You know, and so there's sorts of things. It's like those small iterations make a huge impact. And you know, when you're looking at controlling costs more broadly, you know, you can have a look at these, you know, strategies. And I spent the last year working in a consulting firm in a strategic advisory role. And you know, there's a number of engagements where you're sort of saying, here's our, you know, 4-year strategic plan to help you achieve your business model of the future, which is really important. But actually, you're going to need people who are good at executing it today, tomorrow, the next day, the next day. And that for me is something that's a skill that we learn in the military, which is where do I want to be in the future, but actually how do I get there? And I think that's something that gets a little missed.
You know, simple is the new black. You know, to look at it from a footy analogy, just kick straight. You know, do the basic stuff first, and everything just, you know, falls into place. So where are we now in your Audi career, mate? So now you're looking after the shed.
Yeah, so I did that for a couple of years. At one stage, I had the warehousing team and I had the transportation team. And because I was a Royal Australian Transport Corps person in defence, you know, transport was, you know, like my second nature. So, you know, for me, putting warehousing and distribution networks together makes sense because that's how we work in defence. We don't necessarily separate it out. And so I worked with that for about 3 or 4 months, and I had about 200 employees or so, 15 direct employees. It was crazy, but it was, you know, it was. I felt really alive because there was just so many things happening at any one time, and it was great. But it probably wasn't sustainable for the long term, but it worked for what needed to happen. And I actually was approached by the managing director of supply chain at Aldi and asked if I would move to Sydney and be one of his directors to set up the supply chain team for Aldi. So traditionally, Aldi had a federated model, a decentralized model where each of these DCs sort of ran their own show. And what they wanted to do was create a centralized model where there was a central supply chain team that looked at it from a national view. And they had a small little acorn in there already that moved some shipping containers, about maybe 10,000 shipping containers annually, and mostly for that stuff you see down the middle of Aldi, the special buys. And they wanted to grow Aldi's influence over the supply chain and create a version of Woolworths Primary Connect. And so Woolworths have their own logistics organisation called Primary Connect, and they do a lot of transportation, road, rail, sea, etc. And they wanted to set that up for Aldi, and they asked me to come in and do that for them. And so I accepted and moved to Sydney in the middle of 2018. And it's been a bit of a wild ride since. So I stepped into an organisation that was had no clear plan, would be the way I'd describe it. Wasn't sure what it wanted to be. Didn't really know how to get there, and had resources or people that had been working in the organisation for, you know, quite some time, and didn't necessarily have a vision of what the future could look like. And so for me, it was very clear when I came into that role. I was basically creating, you know, brigade headquarters. Would be the way I describe it.
Well, mate, this is about time that we caught up again. And I remember it would have been Anzac Day down at Coogee Bay Hotel, catching up over a beer or two. But I was actually, I couldn't believe that. Actually, weren't you just in the army yesterday, and now you're supply chain director at Audi? Like, I was like, where did that come from?
That's just right place, right time. But and also, you know, I was very, very lucky that I had some advocates that supported me in Aldi to give me that job. I think, you know, I worked in that role for a few years and then moved on. The reflection that I would have of myself is that, yes, I was very lucky to have that role. It was a really, really fantastic learning experience for me. But I was probably one of the few people in Aldi who was technically competent in supply chain, had a strong operations background internationally and locally and from defense, and knew how to work in an ambiguous, difficult environment where stakeholders weren't necessarily happy with you at any stage, and how to start something off the ground. And really what I always came back to in that scenario, I remember someone saying to me, "What's it like?" And I said, "It's like treading water and someone keeps pouring more water in at the same time." And it makes me think, about, focus on what you know and what you know about yourself. And what I knew about myself was that I had been in some random situations in my time in defense, and all of them I'd found a way through. And, it's not a case of me finding a way through them. It's actually me and the people around me finding a way through them. So how do I find the right advocates? How do I find people to talk to and advice that I needed to help me through that?
These themes just keep coming back and back. The more I learn and explore this military mindset for business for myself, these same core principles come back. How to delegate to elevate, empower people to be multipliers for you. It's not about holding on to things. You've got to empower those things around you, because we're only limited in what we can do.
And
Being
I think
brilliant at the basics.
Yeah, and I think the other key one is try and take your ego out of the equation. And it's not an easy thing, particularly when your ego is being like hammered by, where people come to you and say, "Oh, I'm not very happy with this, and what you're doing, I don't like," and blah, 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 blah. And it's hard, particularly when you're putting a lot of yourself into it, to be like, actually, this isn't like I need to be aware of my ego here. I need to be aware of how this is making me feel and how I'm reacting. And I should go and ask someone about it, people I trust. And so probably the biggest learning I had in that job was many, but one of the biggest learnings was I need a network of advisors around me who I can talk to. And so it was at that point, people had said to me, it's good to have mentors in your network. And I didn't really have many. And it was at that point that I was like, I need to actively go and find some mentors and ask their help. And I felt very vulnerable doing that, because, all of a sudden, I'm asking people who I don't really know that well to come and help me, and saying, "Hey, can you give me a hand? I kind of need some support." And I was very grateful that I found about 3 or 4 very good mentors, one who was ex-military, one who wasn't, that all just immediately said, "Yes, I'd love to give you some advice if you think I'm the right person."
Now, when you did humble yourself, even though you were in an executive and a leadership position at that time, how did you feel that those mentors responded? Because it's always a bit of it is a vulnerable moment when you have to go and say, "Hey, I need help with this." But what was the reaction of the mentors to you actually, being open and honest about what you needed in terms of support and to grow yourself?
It's super comforting, to be honest. Like, they were so gracious, in their offer of support. And I think because they sort of recognized that they probably were in the same boat, 10, 15, 20 years ago, and had to do the same. And I think, I reflect, what would I be like? And I would be the same. I mean, it's awesome to have people to help guide and give some advice to. So I was very grateful for it. And I still keep in touch with them, once every 2 or 3 months at the moment.
And this is, again, is part of the military mindset. One of the things that we were forced to do really early, for me, back in the early part of my military training, was, again, to let your ego at the door. And like, if you were doing little things like doing a presentation, you would rehearse in front of your mates. Because being invulnerable and saying, "Hey, I need a hand with this. Can you give me like some tips?" Doing those simple rehearsals and asking for guidance and asking for support are so empowering in terms of you actually being competent and effective when the moment comes.
Yeah. And I think it helps to be consultative. And so from the corporate perspective, consultation is so extremely important. And I think there's a natural desire to consult with people who you trust. And that comes from, as you mentioned, as juniors saying, "I've got to keep rehearsing this," or as a team, we're rehearsing this in preparation for this, orders group that we need to give to a large organization.
I've got to say, man, I'm going to ask you a personal question. How old are you now?
36.
You're 36, right? So came out of school, went to ADFA, 9 years in the military. You've been now a director of a global billion-dollar company, in terms of your specific role. When did you think, sorry, I'm going to just come back to Audi before we move on. When did you feel, at what point did you start making real impact on that company, whether it be through the bottom line or whether it be through, some kind of influence? How long did it take you to actually create that impact?
I think the first part was I actually had to relearn how to be in the corporate world when I went to the national office. So when I was working in Queensland, I was on the operational side. The way I describe it, it's like being in a combat brigade, right? So everyone has a clear goal that they want to achieve, and then all of a sudden I was in divisional headquarters with everyone under the sun who were doing different jobs that I didn't understand. And the political landscape was very, very, very different. And also, there's political landscapes around sort of where people are in their professional journey. And so one of the mistakes I made pretty early on when I went into that role was just assuming everyone wanted the same thing, which was, let's just grow the business as fast as we can. They want that, but they sort of want it in a different way. They want to grow this part here and that part there. And for me, I always felt it was the same, which was it all comes to one big bucket of money, which is Aldi's money. So it doesn't matter how it gets there. Let's just make sure it's the most amount that can get there. And so, for me, it was more about actually understanding what was driving those people in those organizations, and then how to engage with them so that, you can work more effectively together. And I think it took me, and also understanding my job as well, took me a little bit of time, and learning the market, because it was kind of one of the first roles I had where I had a direct exposure to all of the large logistics organizations in the corporate sector, and sort of what market share they had, what their strengths were, what the opportunities were, and who were the personalities that were driving their strategic objectives and how they align with ours. So it took me probably about a year or so to start making an impact. And I think the key moment for me was Aldi was having real challenges with capacity in their distribution network. So they had 8 DCs, and in particular, their frozen parts of their DCs are quite small and contained because they're very expensive. But unless you're running a super productive throughput, it's very challenging to manage your inload and outload. And this became a huge problem. They were spending a lot of money on additional warehousing around the capability. What became super clear to me was that actually we just needed to get everyone in a room that had a stake, had some skin in the game, had some involvement in this process from end to end, and explain the problem and talk about it and come up with a joint solution. And it's funny, I called it the supply chain working group. It was the first one that Aldi had ever had, which was a cross-functional working group with an objective, but it was co-led. So it was basically me finding various colleagues who had enough influence in their areas, pulling them together and saying, let's actually put all of our cards on the table. Let's put all the problems on the table. Let's understand the why we've got this situation, and then let's together build a path of resolution that's going to actually be mutually beneficial to everyone in this room. And that was about about 18 months into that job.
Yeah, this is it's a really cool journey for me to see you just be able to evolve and flourish in that environment just by applying the same principles of believing in yourself and believing in the skills and the systems you've got at your disposal. So, mate, in terms of what's next, so you're where are you at the moment in terms of where you are and where your journey's leading you to?
Yeah, so after I had a couple more years in that role, and when I was finished in the operational role at Aldi, I worked in a transformation role, preparing them for an information systems ERP that was coming in, and that was about basically an organizational redesign and building some new capability in that they needed to kind of round that picture out. And I kind of got to the point again where I looked at sort of, is there much left here for me to achieve about what I would like to do? And I've been in Aldi for 7 years at this stage, and I thought, well, let's try something new. And I managed to get hired with a consulting firm, and I ran their supply chain practice. And for me, it was a really cool experience. I was employee number 1 in this organization, and so I had to hire people in behind me. There was no pipeline of work, so I had to go and build all that too. Unfortunately, we were resource constrained a little bit, so I had to be very, very deliberate in the way that I went about it. And I think, again, I remember reflecting, trying to think about the plan, about how we do this, reflecting on my time in defence and going, actually, if you're going to bet, you bet big, but you bet big with contingency. So you look at, where am I going to, what's my main effort? how am I going to reinforce my main effort, but how am I going to reduce the downside risk that comes with this? And so that's sort of what I did, and I managed to secure quite a large piece of work with a multi-billion-dollar drinks organization that do crisps and chips as well, and did a supply chain transformation with them. But what I found when I was working in consulting was I missed being a part of a team going in the same direction for a long period of time. Which, that was really the part that's missing for me. And I've actually done a lot of reflection recently to think about, like, why was I missing that so much? And it fundamentally goes back to the reason that I joined the Defence Force in the first instance, the reason I loved being in the Defence Force and the jobs I've had, which is I really love working with people, and finding those people around me and developing them and growing them and empowering them to do their job. And that's one thing that in consulting can be quite transactional at times.
Well, mate, I really appreciate you, spending a little bit of time with me. It's great to see you again, not only as a mate, but for me to learn a lot about, you and your journey and how you've actually been able to apply this, on a daily, monthly, yearly basis into your new career. I just want to come and summarize here about a few of my key takeaways from how you've been able to apply this military mindset for business. And that for me, again, coming back to being brilliant at the basics, just doing the little things right. So I've got 3 points here. We've got brilliant at the basics, how we empower people, and systems and processes like consistency. The other thing that surprises me a little bit about the chat today, that big companies have the same problem as small companies. They're maybe just a scale thing. Mm-hmm. And when it's like this French accordion, like everything's good, but when we pull it apart really quick, where are the gaps, that are going to sit in there?
And I think that it's something that people think about when they say, well, where can I make a change? Where can I have impact? And people think large businesses, they've got everything together. They understand how things work. They must be executing really well. Otherwise, how could they be successful? Scale gives you a lot of help in that. But actually, it's about finding those little areas and going, here's an opportunity for me to make an impact. And here's how I go about it. I mean, and I think, whether or not you're a large business or a small business, having a second set of eyes to say, you could probably do that better, or you could do that differently, I think is something that you can't really put a price on, to be honest.
So Luke, mate, you are the epitome for me of what military mindset for business is about. The way you've been able to embrace those early experiences, your career in combat zones, and really living, logistics at the sharp end, through to, into third line, more strategic logistics in Australia, getting that out and literally, practically applying that in corporate to the point where in a very, very short time, you're director of supply chain, for a multi-billion-dollar global company, or the Australian chapter of it anyway. Just congratulations on your success. So I'm going to just put Luke's LinkedIn profile into the show notes below. If you're listening to it, connect with him on LinkedIn and follow his journey. Like a really clever and inspirational guy. And mate, I really appreciate your time sharing your thoughts with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Pete. Really great to see you again, and really, really enjoyed the chat, and hopefully we can catch up over a couple of beers soon.
Yeah, definitely. So thanks for listening to this episode of the Military Mindset for Business podcast. Do that click, like, share thing below. Luke, cheers for your time, and out.
Thanks very much, Pete. Talk to you later.